Good morning. My name is Willem van Meurs, and I would like to thank Professor Hans Zwart for his invitation to give this introductory lecture on modeling as part of biological control systems. I'm sorry we have to do this in these conditions. I'm now in my home office in La Haye-Toupière, France. I hope you're all well and in good health. I'm I'll do two things. I'll work on your motivation, hopefully, for this field of modeling and simulation, and I'll try to provide you with a framework for how to tackle a modeling and simulation problem, and then we'll have a short exercise at the end. The whole class is an exercise as it were. So for the motivation, I choose three topics. Your colleagues, predecessors, designed an empirical model for educational simulation of cervical dilation, and that resulted in an article. So we'll use that article, which also gives the different phases of modeling and simulation. Then I'll share with you a recent development, which we call an explanatory model in neonatal intensive care, which is an article and an associated piece of software developed with a neonatologist, Tim Antonius from Nijmegen. And at the end of this first lecture, I'll point you to two videos of training simulators, model-driven training simulators I developed at the University of Porto and the University of Florida, respectively. Many of you will have had exposure to the human patient simulator. Here are the two references that I'll use for the first two aspects. The framework and really the chapters of my lectures, if you want to, are well, the modeling and simulation procedure, where I'll use the paper, Geoffrey et al. Paper as an example. Then we'll take a step back, and I'll have questions about reality and systems thinking, very fundamental issues before we even can start thinking about modeling and simulation. But then we'll really get into it. We'll derive conceptual and mathematical models, first of a simple physical system, then of a biological system, the cardiorespiratory system, and we'll take a few inroads into the mathematical modeling of the cardiovascular system. Most of those lectures will use my 2011 book as a reference. Most of you in your first year got a shortened version of this book, and Hans Zwart has 5 copies of the full book, I believe, for the class. So you will get access to this reference as well. Then we have an exercise which I changed from last year. I had a few visitors. I had another group of people visiting me here in France last week, a group of technical medicine students. And the faculty involved there was Berend Westerhoff, and he and I discussed that we'll do an exercise around conceptual mathematical modeling of a model of the arterial circulation. And so I'll introduce the conceptual mathematical model, and then in another class he will use that model in various exercises. Because we have to do this at a distance, and this is new to me as well, I've structured this as follows. I'll have a number of short lectures and slides, like the one going on, which is number 1, and they're all presented in MP4 format, so that everybody can watch them without having to depend on a specific version, for example, PowerPoint. Then there's a number of support documents, mostly in PDF form, and then and there's an order to both the lectures and the support documents, and I suggest that you work on those and then email me questions after each lecture and session with support documents, and then I'll answer to the whole group. So like a question in class, I get a question from a specific student, and everybody gets access to the answer for that. And I'll answer those questions today and tomorrow, but not beyond that. I'll have to check on my available time. As I said, so there was a follow-up to this biological control systems class in 2016-2017 with this group of students, some of whom you may recognize, and they wanted to do a follow-up project in the form of a Capita Selecta, and that was during a quartile that I wasn't in Twente, but they said, well, no problem, we'll come and see you in France, and so they did, and as a matter of fact, last week I had another group of students who come and see me, and this picture here is taken at the Gavarnie Circus, close to the Spanish border. Very enjoyable way to do education and research, and very effective as well. A number of presentations and publications came out of that. So among them, this one by first author is Silvano Geffery, which by now has had close to 2,000 accesses. It's only a paper from mid 2018, and that's the paper I'll point to again for wrap up of this lecture, or as an exercise after this lecture. But I'll give you a little bit of background. So when a woman goes into labor and delivery, it's actually the fetus starting to push on the fetus inside the uterus and starting to push on the cervix, and that sends signals to the brain and causes oxytocin release. Oxytocin gets into the bloodstream and then starts stimulating the contractions again. So this is a positive feedback system, and it's a reinforcing loop, and we get more and faster contractions and deeper contractions, and then this thins the cervix, opens the cervix, and then the baby gets out. Your colleagues modeled this process, and I'll let you read about it. As I said, we're going to use this paper to look at a procedure for modeling and simulation. My biggest challenge, first personally and then with my assistants, was that modeling and simulation of physiology requires a lot of different competencies, clinical competencies, physiology, physics, mathematics, programming, and I tried to approach that in a stepwise procedure, which I published in 2011. And so the steps here are, first, we especially separate those different competencies. So in the first step, we talk to the clinicians, the physiologists, and we set model requirements. What do we want from a particular model? And one tool that we use there is an overall block diagram. Then we don't dive right away into a mathematical model, but we make a drawing, usually a block diagram or a detailed network diagram, and I call that a conceptual model. And so we look at systems and subsystems. What are the key variables? What are the causal connections? And sometimes also the interactions. Only then we translate that conceptual model, that drawing, into a mathematical model. So in the conceptual modeling phase, the clinicians and physiologists are often still involved, but mostly technical physicians or biomedical engineers or engineers establish a mathematical model, which is a number of variables, equations, and parameters, the numerical values that govern the relationships between the variables. Once we have a mathematical model, we can implement it in software, MATLAB, C, Java, Python. An important part of software implementation is code verification. If we don't do that right, our results are not reliable. And once the code is verified, we obtain simulation results and do model validation. Most academic projects stop there, but of course model use is very important as well, and a model can be used to answer a research question, but it can also be used, for example, to drive an educational simulator. So use is definitely part of my personal ambition for models. The different phases of biological control systems, the class, match this. The model requirements correspond to formulating a clinical research question. I broke up the design of a model in two phases, conceptual and mathematical model. I didn't mention here analysis of dynamic behavior, but that's definitely part of the class as well. We have a lot of models that are multi-variable, nonlinear, sometimes time variant. So analysis isn't always easy, but it's possible, and it provides with some very solid conclusions even before we do a simulation. And Hans Zwart will tell you more about the analysis aspect of the dynamic behavior. And then we do the simulations, and there's two aspects to that, as far as I'm concerned: software implementation and code verification, and then the actual simulation results and model validation. And then our use will be limited to answering the clinical research question that we set into the beginning. And you'll see that actually the format, the standard format of scientific papers, introduction, methods, results, discussion, conclusion will actually closely match this scheme as well. Before the next lecture, I would like for you to read the Geffery paper. It's only 4 pages, I believe it's only 4 pages long. And your main task there will be to see if you can identify the 5 steps in the modeling and simulation process, because they're, as I said, this is written as a scientific paper. And then please get the paper by Tim Antonius and myself and study the conceptual model in figure 3. You feel free to read the whole paper, but you can also just focus on figure 3 and look at that conceptual model of a very complex situation. If you have time, download and run the explanatory model software. 2 more pieces of background information. There's a short video which I would have preferred to show you and comment on it, but you can look at it on YouTube. The title is at the bottom of my slide. This is an early video on the use of the human patient simulator in a hospital in New York. I believe it was the first simulator we installed. And there's a video of the Lucina childbirth simulator. Both are very short videos, but that's a model-driven simulator we developed at the University of Porto, and it does provide context to the Geffery paper as well. So that concludes our, once you're done reading this background material, concludes our modeling and simulation procedure via an example. And my next lecture will be about the more general topic of questions about reality and systems thinking. Just in case, if you have time, during the COVID period, I recorded a short 12-minute autobiographical video about my path through modeling and simulation. So feel free to listen to that, and you'll get a bit broader perspective on these different topics, but it's definitely an optional thing. So thank you for listening, and work with the background material Email me questions if you have any, and then we'll go to the next lecture. Take care.